So much to talk about, as always, with the Supreme Court and the major cases now that everyone paying attention to is impact on this election, specifically right now with rulings coming on immunity. What are you surprised about in the way this has gone so far?
Well, I was surprised by the argument before the Supreme Court in April because it seemed going in that this was a pretty clear case, that Trump's claim that he has absolute immunity for acts he committed in office is just too broad, that this is this idea that the president is not bound by the rule of law. The lower courts had rejected it. It seemed kind of obvious. And then it did not seem obvious at all while the justices were talking about it. They didn't seem really interested in focusing on this set of criminal claims against former President Trump. They were talking about a ruling for the ages, as Justice Gorsuch put it, raising all kinds of hypotheticals that are not in this case about the scope of immunity and how a ruling that didn't allow for some immunity could go too far in limiting the president's powers. And so it was a kind of upside down moment, I think, for a lot of people watching, where we thought going in the problem was Trump claiming that he wasn't bound by law. And the conservative justice seemed to be worried about what would happen to future presidents if they made it clear that the criminal law did apply.
Because, I mean, some of the things we've heard from the Trump attorneys seem on their face ludicrous. Now, I'm not an expert on jurisprudence, but the notion that you could order the assassination of your political adversary might actually have immunity seems like the kind of thing that would apply to, say, Vladimir Putin and not to, say, Joe Biden. Because, I mean, let's face it, this election could be over quickly if that were the case.
Right. So it would have seemed going in that you can't order such an assassination or order a military coup without facing future criminal prosecution. And remember, we're only talking about former presidents. We're not even talking about prosecuting someone who's still holding office. And yet, suddenly, those questions were not driving the argument. Instead, we were talking about things like, well, this was Justice Alito. I think the most extreme point was the idea, well, if presidents did fear criminal prosecution in the future, then they would pardon themselves. They might do all kinds of corrupt things to avoid being held accountable. And so that's what I mean by kind of through the looking glass, upside down world. And there were certainly liberal justices, Ketanji Brown Jackson, for example, saying, wait a second, what are you talking about? But it wasn't clear whether they had a majority.
Well, they don't have a majority, let's put it that way, but it is a question to me of whether the intention here is to make a ruling that stands up legally or to kick the can to ensure that the Supreme Court doesn't have to deal with this issue during an election cycle. How much of this is about timing?
A lot seemed to be about timing. I think, well, they're already dealing with it during the election cycle, but I think it seemed almost impossible that Trump would face trial for these federal charges about trying to subvert the election in 2020. Almost impossible to imagine he would face trial before November 24. So that almost was not even on the table anymore. And then you have this question, okay, well, if the justices are looking ahead, where are their 5 votes? Could there be 5 votes for a ruling that still allows for a prosecution based on all the things Trump did as a candidate, not as president? This kind of question of official acts versus unofficial acts. His lawyer actually conceded that a lot of the things in the indictment are private acts, not necessary to holding office. And so you could imagine a trial after the election, after a whole other process in the district court to kind of sort through which charges are which, that could still happen.